Hi, everyone. I'll be going over chapter 5 today from our McKinley textbook for anatomy and physiology. Chapter 5 is when we start getting into how cells come together to form tissues and perform different functions that eventually will lead to those tissues becoming organs. So, as promised from the previous chapter, we had briefly mentioned the junctions between cells and how cells become tissues. I want to review it again. So, that's what kind of this introduction slide is here. So, we have a few definitions, tissues and histology. So, the study of tissues is termed histology, which is why in your laboratory lab structure list, you have histology sections where we're looking at tissues under the microscope. The definition of tissues is a group of similar cells with a common function. So these cells are similar to each other, they come together with these junctions and they perform a function. So let's just review those different junctions again. There are multiple junctions between cells, but these are the main three: tight junctions, desmosomes, and gap junctions. And we have a picture kind of showing up here. Tight junctions are strands or rows of proteins linking cells together, so much so that they fuse their membranes together. Okay, these are very tight connections between cells. And the idea for this type of connection is it's preventing substances from passing in between the cells. Desmosomes are a little bit different. So their main function is for structural support. So they're composed of proteins and they bind the cells together. We might see an example of one here, and it's got some deeper connections in here. The idea is that it creates these spot welds between cells. So if the tissue is moving or it's very fluid, these cells do not come apart just for anything. They are structurally connected to each other with these very strong spot welds, desmosomes. The last type that we review in this class is gap junctions. You can see the picture right here. Gap junctions are tiny fluid-filled tunnels that actually connect cells together and allow for substances to pass between the cells. This could be different ions or gases going from one cell to the other. So that's kind of our review of cells and how they get connected together to form tissues. As far as tissues go, there are four major types of tissue in the body. And we really focus in this chapter on epithelial and connective tissue, but we will touch on muscle and nervous tissue, but know that we'll go deeper into those in future chapters. So let's start with epithelial tissue. I cannot impress to you enough the importance of each of these kind of summary slides at the beginning for each type of tissue. Very, very helpful to give you the general characteristics of these tissues as we go on to explore them in future slides. So these slides are super important. So for epithelial tissue, okay, general characteristics, they cover organs and body surface. So we can think of the body surface like the skin. So part of the skin is in the epithelial tissue. And then the surface of different organs also have an epithelial tissue layer. Not only that, but inside the organs, it lines cavities. Okay, so if you have an organ that's hollow, it's going to also have an epithelial layer lining its cavity. And organs I can use kind of loosely, right? So organs could be what you think of as your standard viscera in the body, but I'm even talking about blood vessels, okay? Blood vessels are hollow, have blood going through them. They're going to be lined with an epithelial layer as well. Epithelial tissue also make up glands. We're going to see glands in this chapter that are made up of the cells that we consider part of epithelial tissue. More features. So when we look at epithelial tissue, the top part, okay, facing the outside, we would call the free surface. And then the bottom part of the tissue, and again, it's going to have cells in between, is called the basement membrane. Basement being the bottom of the house, the free surface being the top, right? We might call the surface apical as well. This is the most superficial outside surface. Basement membrane is the one that is at the bottom before we start to get to different other types of tissues that sit underneath. What that might look like, just for a little example. So if we have our cells in here making up epithelial tissue, we just have a name for the top layer. That's the apical layer, free surface. And then the bottom layer is called the basement membrane for all of our epithelial tissues. This is how we know the boundaries between this tissue and then the next ones that we learn. To continue on, lots of characteristics. These are some really good ones. So for epithelial tissue, we consider this avascular. A meaning no or not, vascular referring to blood vessels. So epithelial tissue actually does not have blood vessels in it. So say we are talking about the skin and we damage the epithelial layer of the skin. You are not going to see blood because there's no blood vessels there. And when you think about blood vessels in the body, especially for the context that we're going to get into for this course, blood brings nutrients and takes away waste. So if we're thinking about an organ that is lined with epithelial tissue or any kind of tissue thriving, it thrives because it's able to get nutrients. Epithelial tissues do not have blood vessels bringing direct nutrients that way, which means that they naturally need to get their nutrients from a different tissue that is sitting next to it, like connective tissue, which we'll get into. So we consider epithelial tissue avascular, no blood supply there, no direct blood supply. Second kind of thing is that epithelial tissues are considered highly mitotic. We mentioned just briefly in chapter 4 that cells reproduce each other, they divide and replicate using mitosis, okay, which is their form of taking one cell and making two. Cells that are highly mitotic mean that they go through mitosis frequently, meaning they readily divide and they can replace themselves, right? So if you have an injury to this type of tissue, because these cells are highly mitotic, they replace themselves quite quickly. Another characteristic of epithelial tissue is that the cells are tightly packed, which means that we are likely looking at tight junctions between these cells for this tissue, where each cell is directly next to each other, so much so that it looks like their membranes are fusing together. Lastly, and I know you've already kind of looked at this in the lab, but epithelial tissues also have different shapes and layers that we use to name them. The main shapes for epithelial tissue could be squamous, cuboidal, or columnar, and their name does kind of tell you what shape they are. Squamous cells are flat or squashed, cuboidal cells are cube-shaped, and columnar cells are column-shaped, tall, elongated cells. We also name an epithelial tissue by the number of layers that are present with these cells. If it's just one layer of cells, we call it simple. Multiple layers we would call stratified. And then we have a few exceptions here. One is called pseudo-stratified, pseudo meaning false, stratified meaning layers. So this type of tissue appears to be multiple layers, but it is truly just one layer, false layers. So let's continue on, and I'll erase this real quick. All right, so let's get into those classifications, right? And just to put it again, right, if it's a simple epithelium, simple is one layer, and all those cells are going to be in contact with the basement membrane, which is just the bottom layer of the tissue, right? And then the tops of those cells is the apical layer. Simple tissues have very simple functions. They filter, absorb, or secrete primarily. If it's just one layer of cells, they're going to do that. Stratified has multiple layers, okay, which will still do the same function as the primary layer, but usually they're in areas where there might be high mechanical stress, things that might be trying to tear away at this tissue. And so we have extra layers underneath to help with that. And then again, pseudostratified appears layered, but is not quite layered. So we'll talk about what that means. So let's look at these shapes as well. Squamous cells are flat, wide, irregularly shaped. Their nucleus is generally very flat, okay? We can see squamous cells here. So these are simple squamous, right? Because one layer of flat cells. And even here, when we have a stratified epithelium, this is one layer of flat cells, or multiple layers of flat cells as well. So we would call this stratified squamous. Even if some of these lower layers look cuboidal, they are still squamous. For cuboidal cells, they're going to look like this. Their nuclei is going to be in the center of the cell. It's going to be spherically shaped, and they are cube shaped, so they are as tall as they are as wide. And then we have these columnar shaped. They are slender, taller, elongated. Usually their nucleus is elongated as well, so it'll be oval shaped. And we do have another type of cell called transitional cells found in the urinary system. We're not going to get too deep into that in this class, but the cells can change shape depending on how they're stretched. So we'll just go into each kind, okay, of epithelial tissue just by whether it's one layer or two layers and by its shape. And we'll take a look at where you might find this in the body and what its function is as well. So for simple squamous, we have a single layer of flat cells. And typically where we're going to find that, this example here is of the lungs, specifically the alveoli, which are the air sacs in the lungs. And so we could just see that it's one layer and it's not in a nice flat shape like this, like a nice rectangle, right? They kind of make up these air pockets and it's just one layer of flat cells. You also see this, okay, in the walls of blood vessels where we see one layer of flat cells called endothelia. You can see this in the kidneys and Bowman's capsule. You can see this even in our serous membranes as part of their layering, their epithelial layer. So this is just one layer of flat cells. The idea for this is to allow rapid movement of molecules across the surface. So kind of one of the main functions, right, is for rapid diffusion, right? Moving molecules across cells is a diffusion kind of thing. So this facilitates rapid diffusion or even filtration of something on one side of the tissue moving through the cells to the other because it's just one layer of thin cells. For simple cuboidal, okay, main function for cuboidal cells as well as columnar cells is going to be absorption and secretion, especially since they line a lot of glandular tissue where we either absorb things or we secrete them out. And so you can kind of see here, this is a gland within the kidney, okay? And this is the lumen. So this is where they might be absorbing things or dumping things out. And you can see that there's just this line of cuboidal cells. Okay, so simple cuboidal. And this structure is super ideal. Usually the cuboidal cells kind of come in a circle around the lumen of the gland, right? So I might have my cuboidal cells sort of, and sorry, not the best at drawing, sort of like this, where the middle is open, but we're surrounded by cuboidal cells that all might either be absorbing things or secreting things into this gland. And that's like kind of a specific shape for the gland. And again, whether it's cuboidal or columnar, they mostly do absorption and secretion. Next one is columnar. Again, simple columnar would be single layer of elongated or tall cells. We can see for this one here, this is part of the digestive system where we're going to see these types of cells. We may even have a goblet cell intertwixt in here. A goblet cell is part of the epithelium, but it is not the epithelia itself. In the digestive system, where we might find these cells, you can see they're in a really different orientation than you might expect. We can see these elongated cells, their nuclei, okay, for these cells are a little elongated, oval shaped themselves, but they're all in the same line with each other. When we look at simple columnar, they're all about the same height where the nuclei sit. And a lot of times we have little finger-like projections on the surface. Depending on the cell type, we could call them microvilli, which is what we call them in the digestive system. And other systems, we might call them cilia, which is where we get these forms like non-ciliated or ciliated. This one here has microvilli, these finger-like projections meant to move mucus that these goblet cells are producing. And those finger-like projections are part of the columnar cells, just moving things around. Again, similar function to cuboidal cells, secretion and absorption. We have this other classification here for columnar cells, which goes along with our pseudostratified. So anything pseudostratified in the body is going to be related to a columnar cell. And typically we have ciliated pseudostratified columnar cells. So these cells are a little bit different. They are columnar cells, but you notice that their nuclei are all over the place, right? They're not one nice line like the previous slide. And their nuclei being in different arrangements because of the way the cells are arranged makes you think that there's multiple layers. But really, there's just one layer, which is why we call it pseudostratified. These pseudostratified columnar cells almost always have cilia, okay, unless you damage them. And the cilia act like these carpet-like fibers to move mucus around, mucus that is created by the goblet cells. And they primarily line not the digestive tract like our simple columnar, but they line respiratory pathways. And so when we produce mucus as part of our respiratory protection, these cilia on these pseudostratified columnar cells move that mucus towards our throat. So we swallow it and get rid of any debris that might have been trapped inside that mucus. And since this is still an epithelial tissue, we still have a basement membrane down here, and the apical surface, we would say, is where the cilia is, that top surface. Let's move into stratified things, so things with multiple layers. So stratified squamous, very, very common inside the body, okay? Multiple layers of these flat cells. But what's kind of interesting is, and this confuses people, so just be aware of this, the basal layers close to the basement membrane, they look cuboidal, even though they are stratified squamous. And then as we get towards the top, the apical surface, we start to have that more traditional squamous shape. It does confuse people a little bit. Because we have multiple layers of flat cells, it's not playing the same role of diffusion and filtration like simple squamous does in the lungs. Instead, because we have multiple layers here to play with, this is really a protective type of tissue against abrasion and friction. That way, the top layers can kind of slough off if we damage them and then be replaced by those bottom layers. In this type of tissue at the basal layer, we have mitotic cells, which we call stem cells, which continuously divide to replace other cells that are lost. Don't worry about this keratinization for now. We'll get to that in the skin. A great example, even though we don't have a picture for stratified squamous, actually is the skin. So your top layer of the skin, epidermis, is made up of stratified squamous. And for some reason, I took out of here stratified cuboidal and stratified columnar. They are going to play the same exact purpose as simple cuboidal and simple columnar. They just might be found in different parts of the body. This last one is transitional epithelium. And if you remember, as I mentioned before, this is found exclusively in the urinary system. And basically, the cells don't follow a traditional shape of one way or the other. They change or transition based on how the tissue stretches. So transitional epithelia is very stretchy. We find it in the urinary bladder, which is where we get these two examples here. When your bladder is empty, meaning it's not being stretched, the cells look cuboidal, okay? But as the bladder gets full with urine, it starts to expand and distend, pushing those cells, kind of stretching them out. And that would make these cells then look less cuboidal and more squamous, just depending on the state of the bladder, which is why we would call this type of epithelial tissue transitional. All right, we're going to move into glands for this chapter because we know that epithelial tissue lines and makes up our glands. There's two different types of glands in the body. We have endocrine glands, which we're going to get to at the end of this class. These ones are ones that will make hormones that go directly into the bloodstream. So they're considered ductless or do not have ducts that release to an organ or release to the outside of the body. The ones we're going to talk about in this chapter are exocrine glands. They have epithelium kind of lining them, and they do have a duct that usually whatever we secrete goes outside the body or to the lumen or wherever. Excuse me. Some examples of these are going to be sweat glands, mammary glands, salivary glands. We're going to get into some of these examples in this chapter, but also in the skin. So one more thing before we get into our main gland types for exocrine glands. Your glands can either be unicellular, one cell. We saw this with previous tissue. I'll just go back real quick. These goblet cells. These are actually considered unicellular glands because they're made of one cell and they do secrete something. They secrete mucus. Okay, so that's part of their thing. Most of the glands we're going to talk about, though, for exocrine glands are multicellular. So a bunch of cells are going to line the gland and line the duct. and then produce things that come out. Don't worry about these additional terms. So these are our main glands. We have merocrine, apocrine, and holocrine. I would come up with a mnemonic or something to remember them in order for MAH, because as we go in order, this tells us a bit more about its secretion, and its secretion gets larger as we go down the glands. So for merocrine glands, they have secretions that are packaged into vesicles. We've talked about vesicles. Vesicles are kind of vehicles that surround a substance. We learned that for endocytosis and exocytosis. We also learned that for the Golgi apparatus. But these vesicles basically are released from the gland tissue via exocytosis, right? So all that's being produced is the secretion in this gland, and then it comes out on the surface. We see this with lacrimal or tear glands, okay, and salivary glands. Apocrine glands, we have a bit more of a secretion coming out. So this is our next level. Apocrine glands actually have part of their surface, part of the cell, pinch off, and it's part of the secretion. So not only are we secreting whatever substance we make, but part of the cell is coming off itself, which can cause a problem. We'll talk about that. Some examples are your mammary glands and your ceruminous glands, earwax glands. And then the last type of gland is your holocrine glands. In holocrine glands, the entire cell comes off in the secretion. So the cell will eventually disintegrate with the secretion being released, but in this gland, the whole cell comes off. A really good example of this is sebaceous glands. These are oil glands in the skin and hair. So let's get some pictures to give more of a visual of what we're seeing, okay? So what we can kind of see here is we have these cuboidal cells. I would call this epithelia simple cuboidal, right? One layer of cube-shaped cells. And for merocrine, we can see that they are releasing just the product by exocytosis into the duct, right? All we see is the product. The example they're giving here is a salivary gland. And I do notice here ceruminous glands are mentioned alongside merocrine. That is a mistake. Move it over to the apocrine gland side. Merocrine glands are the most common type, and we'll get into some very specific types when we get to the skin. Apocrine gland is another one, and we can see we still have our simple cuboidal cells, but instead of just the secretion for merocrine, we have little pieces of the apical surface of the cell coming off into the duct. And this is pretty common for mammary glands and ceruminous glands. And actually, we'll talk about this a little bit later. Bacteria love to eat the little pieces of cell that are kind of left over, which can cause a particular smell around apocrine glands. The last one here is holocrine, and you can actually see for holocrine, the entire cell is released, okay, filled with product into the duct. And then you see these other cells here going through mitosis or division to replace those lost cells. A really good example of this is your oil glands around your hair follicles on the skin and your hair called sebaceous glands, something we'll also get more into in the skin. That is your epithelial tissue. We'll move on to connective tissue here. So for connective tissue, again, I must impress upon you, learning these kind of summary slides is very important in understanding these tissues. So connective tissues have a lot of different types, okay? So just be prepared for that. They're the most abundant tissue type. These types of cells are farther apart than epithelial cells. We saw epithelial cells are basically connected by tight junctions and they're always like next to each other. This is really different with connective tissue because they have an extracellular matrix surrounding them. And extracellular matrix is something called ground substance and fibers, okay, protein fibers that make up and surround the cells. So these cells are not tightly connected to each other. They are kind of, think of fruit in a jello mold, where the fruit are the cells and the jello mold is the extracellular matrix holding them together. What's great about connective tissues is that they do generally have a lot of blood vessels associated with them. So we would say that they have a very good blood supply. And that's going to be very helpful to them because most connective tissues sit underneath epithelial tissues and provide them with nutrients as well. And also, as far as healing ability goes, connective tissues are also very mitotic, so they can replace themselves easily, some more than others based on the type of blood supply that they have. These are the many functions of connective tissues, and I don't expect you to memorize these functions just based off this slide because each function goes with a different type of connective tissue because we have so many different types. So this is kind of the general summary of every type of function that we could find for all the different types of connective tissues. So let's get into their cells first. Our three cell types are resident cells, which will have fibroblasts and adipocytes as part of, and then we're going to actually look into some that are not considered resident cells, but ones that move around a bit more. So resident cells, what I just mean by that is these are stationary cells that are just staying in the tissue, and they generally don't move anywhere. They provide a lot of different functions just based on the cell type. So we're going to look at these two main types right now. First one is fibroblasts. Every time you see a cell that ends in the word blast, this is a cell that builds something or makes something. And in this case, we actually have this prefix here, fibro, which tells us what this cell makes. Fibroblasts are cells that make fibers. These fibers are going to be collagen fibers, elastic fibers, things like that, which are part of connective tissue. So we'll see kind of an example of what this looks like, but we'll end up seeing cells with fibers coming out of them because they're making the fibers that make up connective tissue. Another type of resident cell that we see a lot in connective tissue are adipocytes. These are fat cells. We could have adipose connective tissue, which is just lots of fat cells put together, but you might see also intertwixt in other tissue these adipocytes. These are the immune cells that I was kind of noticing for our connective tissue. We have mast cells and macrophages. These are both playing a function in the immune system for the connective tissue, but play distinctly different roles. Mast cells are fixed, which means they're truly resident and they don't move around a lot in the tissue. And when we kind of think about these types of cells, we think of them as the fire alarm, something that's going to go off if there's something wrong with the tissue in case of injury or infection. They are acting as fire alarms because they release different substances to call the firefighters, which is the second cell type, into the area. The main things that mast cells release are heparin and histamine. Heparin, okay, is to prevent blood clotting in the case of an injury. You might think of whenever you've gone to the doctor's office and you have blood taken from you, those tubes that they put your blood in are heparinized tubes, meaning it's not going to allow your blood to clot, so your blood remains a liquid in those tubes. We don't want blood clotting in an area of injury because we want blood flow to that area so that we can start creating inflammation, swelling, and call other red blood cell or other white blood cells to that area to take care of the infection. We also release histamine, okay? And you might think of allergies where you might take an antihistamine. Histamines cause inflammation, okay, which can lead to redness, swelling, pain, those types of things. Mast cells actually release histamine to enhance the inflammatory response so that we can get cells like white blood cells to come to the area and take care of the injury or infection. One type of cell that will come are macrophages. This is a very general term for certain white blood cells that can do phagocytosis. We learned about this. This is a type of endocytosis where we have cells engulfing other damaged cells, debris, or even whole bacteria and viruses. These are the firefighters. They are called by the mast cells, and these guys are not fixed. They're not just staying around in the tissue. They can move, okay? So they can detach themselves and wander to the area of infection, and then they'll do phagocytosis in an effort to get rid of the infection. And again, we have that kind of, this is just a brief review from our endocytosis chapter from the previous one, chapter 4. Next, let's get into all the different types of tissues we have for connective tissue. And there are a lot here. So we typically separate them into different categories, okay? We have connective tissue proper, which is going to have 6 different types of tissues that are classified as loose or dense. And then we have supporting tissues in here, which are going to be cartilage, bone, and blood. We won't get too much into lymph in this class. So let's get into loose connective tissue first. Loose connective tissue has three different types, and it might be kind of what you would expect for loose. We have fewer cells and more kind of ground substance or extracellular matrix surrounding them. They're loosely connected together versus tightly packed together like dense connective tissue. And so the three main types are areolar, adipose, and reticular. So we'll get into those. First is areolar connective tissue. It is full of fibroblasts. That is the prominent cell type. And so you'll see all these fibroblasts present in this tissue, and they're just producing fibers everywhere. So it makes the tissue look very fuzzy. There is a lot of ground substance surrounding these fibers, surrounding these cells, and we find them in certain areas. They're found in the papillary layer of the dermis, which we'll get into. They're found in the subcutaneous layer. They're found surrounding organs, nerves, muscles, and really they're a very supportive and nutritive tissue because they are highly vascularized, meaning lots of blood vessels in this tissue, meaning that this type of tissue is found in a lot of places in the body to bring nutrients to other tissues. Second type of tissue is adipose tissue. This is fat tissue made up mostly of adipocytes. So we're not seeing fibroblasts in this case, we're seeing adipocytes. And again, each of these individual cell bodies is an adipocyte, making up this adipose tissue. We have adipose all over the body as well. This is different fat tissue. Its main function is to insulate and cushion. The last type of loose connective tissue is reticular tissue. We actually see a lot of fibroblasts in here, okay? And they're making a very specific fiber, not collagen or elastic, but they're making, and you can see them, they stain kind of darkly in here, reticular fibers. This creates a nice meshwork, which is structural for certain tissues, but also houses leukocytes, which are white blood cells, and keeps them in certain tissues. You find reticular tissue a lot in the lymphatic system, which is part of your immune system. So you find this tissue housing white blood cells in the spleen, thymus, the lymph nodes, and even as part of your bone marrow. We switch over to dense connective tissues. Now remember, these have less extracellular matrix between them, so less ground substance, so they're not far apart from each other. A lot of these cells are going to be very close to each other. The three types we have are dense regular, dense irregular, and elastic. For dense regular, you can see in this tissue not much, right? Ground substance, not much extracellular matrix. These cells are really tightly packed. We can see the cell itself in this purple highlighting the nucleus, and then we see lots and lots of fibers really closely packed to each other. These fibers are most likely collagen fibers, okay, with some elastic probably in between. And we don't see much room for anything else. Not a lot of blood vessels, okay? Just the fibroblasts. And typically you see this dense regular tissue in tendons and ligaments. Tendons connect your muscle to your bones, ligaments connect your bones to each other. So these are kind of really strong structural connections with collagen tightly packed together. And because there's very few blood vessels that are able to make their way here, if you damage this tissue, it'll take longer to heal. The second type of dense connective tissue is dense irregular, very, very similar to dense regular, except for the orientation of the collagen fibers. We still have fibroblasts highlighted in this kind of purple in here, but they make their fibers not in these nice lines that are tightly packed like you see for dense regular. They do them in kind of a random, multiple direction, kind of irregular tissue cut type. This is to provide support and resistance to stress. When you have them all lined up in dense regular tissue like this, and there's stress placed in a different direction on this tissue, it could tear pretty easily. This type of tissue can handle a lot more stress because the fibers are not nicely lined up, but they're in a random orientation. You find this in the skin and parts of bone, okay, parts of cartilage. This is like surrounding bone, surrounding cartilage, in the capsules around internal organs, allowing for that support and resistance to stretch. The last type of tissue is elastic tissue. Elastic fibers look kind of curly compared to collagen fibers, which kind of are more straight. And they do have elasticity, so they can stretch and recoil, which is part of their shape. When we look at elastic, dense connective tissue, oftentimes we're going to find it in places where we do have a little bit of stretch and recoil needed, like when arteries are expanding and retracting, right, for the artery wall. We see it in the trachea and the vocal cords, things that kind of maybe move, dilate and constrict quite often, but then need to go back to their original shape, so that elasticity helps. The last type of connective tissues are all the specialized or supporting connective tissues, including cartilage, bone, blood, and lymph. So we'll start with cartilage, okay? And again, this is one of those really nice summary slides that you'll want to kind of memorize going into each tissue type. Cartilage is not very fluid, okay? Its connective tissue or extracellular tissue surrounding it is hardened, right? It's not fully hard like bone, which we'll look at, but it is hardened, okay? And the cells, it has a gel-like ground substance, and then there's cells intertwixt there, which are cartilage cells. Cartilage cells are referred to as chondrocytes. And anytime you see this prefix, this root word, it means cartilage. So chondrocytes are cartilage cells. And because their extracellular matrix is kind of thicker and gel-like, they actually can't just sit in the extracellular matrix. They have to sit in little chambers in the matrix called lacunae. If you have ever injured part of your cartilage, you already know that it doesn't have that much of a blood supply, so it takes a very long time to heal. And because there's lack of blood supply, cartilage tissue is actually surrounded by a different type of connective tissue called the perichondrium, okay, surrounding your cartilage, and it will provide some nutrients. We've seen this perichondrium before. Pull this up. Dense irregular tissue is making up the perichondrium, bringing blood vessels and nutrients to other tissues like cartilage itself so that those cells can survive. There are three types of cartilage in the body, found in different places and serving different functions. The three types are hyaline, elastic, and fibrocartilage. And we can kind of see a little bit of a difference here. So you see all these chondrocytes in their tissues, and they're surrounded by this extracellular matrix, which is a little bit calcified, so it's gel-like. And you can see they're oriented a little differently. This is what hyaline cartilage looks like versus our elastic cartilage, and very different than these kind of straight lines that the chondrocytes make for fibrocartilage. Hyaline cartilage is the most common type in the body. It's very structurally sound. So once hyaline cartilage forms, it is going to be these nice structural connections between bones. It doesn't really move that much. We can see here an example here of the cartilage, costal cartilage connecting the sternum to the ribs. Other places you might find this structural soundness of hyaline cartilage is the nose, and at the ends of each joint. Elastic cartilage has elastic fibers in it, so it does have some flexibility and some recoil. And so we would find this in the larynx, okay, which is your voice box that stretches quite a bit. And even you can think of your external ear, your pinna or auricle, that we're able to bend this cartilage and then it can recoil back to its original shape. The last type is fibrocartilage. It is very, very tough. It has a lot of collagenous, so collagen fibers present throughout this tissue. Its main function is shock absorption. You find it in your intervertebral discs. This is the cartilage between each of your vertebrae that, has to deal with that compression. Okay, so it has to be super tough. You also find it in areas of high pressure, like the knee or the pelvic girdle. We'll get more into these as we get into the skeletal system as well with cartilage. The second type of supportive connective tissue is bone, and it's very, very similar to cartilage, except for its extracellular matrix is highly calcified, right? Really, really tough with these inorganic components like calcium salts, like calcium phosphorus. So we have a very similar looking tissue, okay, to our cartilage, except in bone tissue, all of the stuff surrounding those cells is super calcified, so super hard and tough. And since we're in bone and not cartilage, they're not chondrocytes. Bone cells are called osteocytes. although when we get into the skeletal system, there are multiple types of bone cells. But our general bone cell is an osteocyte, osteo referring to bone. And this suffix or root word site means cell. And so these guys also, in order to not be crushed by their extracellular matrix, also have to sit in those chambers, the lacunae. That's where the osteocytes live. There are two types of bone, which we'll get much more deeply into in the bone chapter. But we have compact bone, which is the hard outer bone, and spongy bone, which is kind of the porous branching bone in certain parts of bone in the center. When we kind of look at this, we can see the porous spongy bone here, and then the hard outer bone is going to be that compact bone. We've seen this picture before, okay? I had even asked if anyone recognized it in class, right? Where we have these little pockets, this dark tissue here. These little dark pockets are the lacunae with the osteocytes inside them, and then everything else around it is calcified extracellular matrix, but we'll have different names for it. Each of these rings making up compact bone tissue are called osteons. For some functions of bone, okay, this would be very generalized functions. They act as levers for movement. They support tissues. They protect vital organs. We do know this. Some additional things, they store minerals, mostly inorganic salts like calcium and phosphorus. And they produce blood cells because they are housing what we call hematopoietic cells, which are stem cells, which are going to create your blood cells, your red blood cells, your white blood cells, and your platelets. So that is another additional very important function of bone. The last types of tissue, okay, for connective tissues are blood and lymph. Do not worry too much about lymph. We'll get more into that in the lymphatic system in part 2. But blood is considered a connective tissue. Its extracellular matrix is fluid, though, and that is what we would call plasma. And then we have the cells, which we call formed elements in the blood. Red blood cells are erythrocytes that carry respiratory gases. Leukocytes are white blood cells that protect against infections and disease. And then we have some cellular fragments, little pieces of cell called platelets, which help us with blood clotting. The last couple sections, okay, involve the last two types of tissue, muscle and nervous. But remember, we're going to have whole chapters in this class on muscle tissue and nervous tissue. So this will just be very brief going through here. So muscle tissue, the cells that are part of this are called fibers, and they are contractile. So they can actually move and they're very fluid with each other. When they contract, this is what allows us to have movement. If it's skeletal muscle attached to our bones, it can have voluntary movement to move our body parts. If it's in the heart, it allows the heart to contract. Or if it's in some of our internal organs, like the digestive system or the urinary tract, it helps us move our food, our urine, our waste throughout the body. There are three main types of muscle tissue. Skeletal, going with this one up here, attached to the skeleton, cardiac in the heart, and smooth for part of your internal organs and your blood vessels. So to start with skeletal muscle, and this is just a really brief overview, it is referred to as striated. So it has these kind of longitudinal lines that you can see in the tissue because when the muscle contracts, it kind of moves like an accordion across each other. This type of muscle is attached to the skeleton, which is why it's called skeletal muscle, and it actually moves the skeleton. We control this movement, which is why we would call this type of muscle voluntary, meaning that we control the movement of our muscles, unless there's some sort of disease or disorder that causes twitching or non-voluntary movement. This is going to be distinctly different from cardiac and smooth muscle, which is not voluntary. So we're not actively telling our heart to beat or our smooth muscle to move different substances throughout the body. We'll get into this a little bit more in our future chapters. Cardiac muscle here, we can see it looks super similar to skeletal muscle. This is exclusively found in the heart. And instead of it being these like cord-like structures all bundled together, we have them bundled together, but they also have branches connecting each of them. And these structures, you can see kind of dark, the lines between them, called intercalated discs. Intercalated discs, coincidentally, contain two different types of cellular junctions. They contain desmosomes and gap junctions, which we'll talk about that importance a little bit later. And again, cardiac muscle is involuntary. We are not telling consciously our heart to keep beating. That would be exhausting, and that would be the only thing that we'd be doing. But since it's involuntary, our brain is still controlling this, but it's subconscious control. The last type is smooth muscle. You can see the fibers look very, very similar, but they kind of bundle together a little differently, and there's no striation. So when these contract, it's not like an accordion moving across each other. This is also involuntary, right? We don't tell different substances to propel through our body. We have these contractions of smooth muscle, which are under subconscious control, involuntary. The last type of tissue is nervous tissue. And what we would call the cells that make up nervous tissue are neurons. Those are our nerve cells. This is what one might look like. This is the most common type of neuron, a motor neuron. And this type of tissue is found in the brain and spinal cord, as well as your nerves. And what we can see in the microscope image here is we have a neuron and it's surrounded by a bunch of other cells that are smaller. Those cells are going to be called glial cells or neuroglia. They don't do the same function as the neurons, which are to transmit nerve impulses, but they are going to help the neurons by protecting them, nourishing them, and supporting them. Lastly, I think this is kind of the last section. These last two slides are going over what happens when we have tissue connected to each other. So we learned mostly about epithelial and connective tissue. And so when we have an epithelial tissue with an underlying connective tissue come together, it forms a membrane in the body. Okay. We already talked about one type of membrane in this class. These are our serous membranes, where we have a visceral and parietal layer, and these are encompassing our parietal epithelial layer and visceral connective tissue layer surrounding the organs. But we also have other types of membranes. We have mucous membranes lining respiratory and digestive tracts. We have the cutaneous membrane, which is your skin, comprised of your epidermis and your dermis. And then we even have synovial membranes, which line your joints. So I have kind of a quick summary slide for these types of things. So these membranes, right, are just your epithelial and connective tissue combined. We have already talked about serous membranes. Mucous membranes, again, have the same kind of layers, an epithelial and connective tissue layer, but they produce mucus. So wherever we might find goblet cells, which is digestive and respiratory tract. And then our next chapter we're going to go into is the skin, and we call the skin a cutaneous membrane. Covers the body's surface, is part of the integumentary system. And when we get into the two layers, the epithelial layer for the skin is going to be the epidermis, and the connective tissue layer is going to be the dermis. So that's what's going to be coming next in our future chapter. And that is it for today. Please let me know if you guys have any questions or concerns, and have a great week. Thanks.